don't you just come on up and let's get this started with the word of prayer. Lord, I just want to say thank you for allowing us to have our friend here. And Lord, as a person who's thought deeply about your word and as a person who's in relationship with you, Lord, I just pray that you would bring out what you want to bring out tonight. And also, Lord, I just ask that your spirit would be right here in this room with us, Lord, that as your saints are gathered, Lord, that you would be here with us powerfully, and that you would help us to have our ears open and our hearts open and our hands ready for what you call us to do in action. We pray these things in your name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Ken.
Okay. Okay, are we functioning here? Uh-huh. Oh, that sounds better. All right, good. Well, in a moment, I'm going to read from the letter to the Hebrews, chapter 8. Before I do that, I'm going to tell you an Irish joke. Give you time to find it. And get used to what you probably think is an accent. I don't have the accent, actually. You have the accent. I speak English. But most Irish stories take place in pubs, and so this is no exception. And in this particular pub, there's a longish bar, and separated by 3 or 4 yards, there are 2 middle-aged men, and they keep looking at each other with suspicion. And finally, one says to the other, "Are you Michael?" "Yes, I'm Michael." "And you're Patrick?" "That's right. We were at school together." "Yes, we were." "Man, you've aged." "You can say that to me, you wrinkled old thing." "Them's not wrinkles, them's laughter lines." Nothing could be all that funny. "What are you doing these days?" "I'm writing poetry." "Poetry, is it? And how's it going?" "I'm stuck." "You're stuck?" "I am stuck." "And what are you stuck on?" "I can't find anything to rhyme with great." "Great? That's ridiculous. There's hundreds of words rhyme with great." "Well, I just need one." "Okay. How about fascinate?" "Fascinate. Fascinate. 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 You're a genius. I can finish my poem now. Do you want to hear it?" "We're better after all this time, haven't we?" "I have a lovely overcoat. I really think it's great. It has 9 buttons down the front, but I can only fasten..." Ah, we're communicating. That's good. Okay, Hebrews chapter 8. Might need the glasses. So, Jeremiah is known as the weeping prophet. Weeping because most of his life, his prophetic life anyway, he was in a position of great tension. And that was because he was a man who was really in touch with God. And he knew what God was planning to do. And that was, he was going to hand over the nation of Judah into captivity. And he wasn't just a man who was really in touch with God, he was also really in touch with people. And he loved his people. And knowing what was going to happen to them brought him into this position of enormous tension. He tried to talk to them about God and tried to talk to God about them and plead for his mercy, etc. And it wasn't going to happen. And so he was known as the weeping prophet. And his heart was broken by his circumstances. And he didn't sleep very well, which I know those of us who have spent a lot of time in church won't really understand. But he didn't sleep very well because of all this tension. But then one night, he slept really well. And he says that my sleep was sweet. And that was because God showed him a step beyond. And so this is quoted in Hebrews chapter 8. And we're going to begin at verse 7. If there had been nothing wrong with that first covenant, no place would have been sought for another. But God found fault with the people and said, "The time is coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their forefathers when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they did not remain faithful to my covenant, and I turned away from them, declares the Lord. This is a covenant I will make with the house of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my laws in their minds and write them on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. No longer will a man teach his neighbor or a man his brother, saying, 'Know the Lord,' because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. For I will forgive their wickedness, and I will remember their sins no more. By calling this covenant new, he has made the first one obsolete. And what is obsolete and aging will soon disappear." So this is God talking about his bride, the nation of Israel. And as his bride, he had entered into a covenant with them, which is, of course, a permanent binding agreement. But it's two-sided. And he formed this covenant with these people. And it was a remarkable relationship. There's a lot of argument about the nation of Israel these days, and people come to blows over the questions. But they are indeed a remarkable people, miraculous in their beginnings. Abraham was told to leave his country. And he went with his wife, not knowing where he was going. I've traveled a lot, and I always like to know I'm going to get home again. And I like to know where I'm going to as well. And I've occasionally had discussions with people in the airlines. One time, I think it was in San Francisco, There was total chaos in the airport. And I got on the plane, and the pilot was standing just inside. And I said, excuse me, this is the flight to Anchorage, isn't it? And he said, I guess. And I said, well, I don't want to get off and find myself in Australia. It's good to know where you're going sometimes. Anyway. And Abraham just left, not knowing where he was going, but knowing he'd never be back again. And the place he was leaving was the center of civilization. And the only life he'd ever known, the only language he'd ever known. And yet it was enough to know that God wanted him to go. And he had nobody to advise him, no forerunner that was an example to follow. He was totally new. And then when Abraham was 75, his wife Sarah was 65, and she'd never once become pregnant because she was barren. Inconceivable, really. And sorry about that. Just testing, sleep already, you see. And God promised him a son. When Abraham was 99, God kept his promise. Sarah was 89 when she became pregnant for the first time. And God had done what he'd said he'd do, but just 25 years later. And that can be a long time when you're 99. You wonder how much time you've got left. And has God forgotten? No. And it was such a joyous occasion, all they could do was laugh. And they were in themselves so helpless and hopeless that this was obviously a miracle. And they laughed. And so the baby was called Isaac, which means laughter. Born when Abraham was 100 and Sarah was 90. And the entire nation descends from that miracle kid who should never have been born. About 700 years later, God kept another promise. They were all slaves. And slaves in the wealthiest, most powerful nation in the world. And God rescued them as a whole nation without any battle, without anybody getting injured, certainly nobody killed. And they left, and they didn't even have to sneak away. The Egyptians couldn't wait to get rid of them. And they gave them all kinds of things, flocks and herds, food, money, jewelry, anything they wanted, really. Just take it and leave. So they did. And then God had a country to give them, a very beautiful country. Most peoples have had to build their own country. Israel didn't have to. It was already there, vineyards and fields and farms and houses and villages and cities and roads, all built already, mostly by giants. And in those days, Caterpillar wasn't a very big company, and they weren't doing much. So if you can't use that, then giants are kind of the next best thing to get your construction underway. And so they walked into this beautiful country, which is described as being flowing with milk and honey, which doesn't, of course, mean it was wet and sticky, just it was really productive and luxurious. And all their needs were met in that land. And God had said he would do that. He said he would protect them and provide for them, and he was doing it. But this was now a covenant, and it was therefore two-sided, and God on his side was to be their God. They were to be his people, and they were to show their trust in him by obedience to the law. And every law was a good law. I mean, now, of course, some laws are good and some are not so good. And, we decide which laws we're going to keep and which laws we're not going to keep, and whether or not we're going to tell anybody that we're not keeping them. And sometimes the law is very irksome, like the speed limit when you're in a hurry. But see, every law that God gave was a good law. And by studying the law, they would know what God is like. Because the law is actually the character of God spelled out in human behavior. See, if God were a man, he would not be an adulterer because he's faithful. So the law says you won't commit adultery. And by studying that law and thinking about it and analyzing it, they would get a picture of the faithfulness of God. God isn't a liar. God isn't a murderer. God doesn't want what somebody else has got. And so every law reveals the character of God. So by studying it, that was a blessing, because they would have this revelation of their God. By keeping the law, they would show what God is like, because they would be living out the character of God, and the nation would be blessed if they all behaved that way, as we would be if we all behaved that way. The only problem with law is sometimes you don't want to keep it. Sometimes you can't, although you want to. Like Paul says, when I want to do a good thing, evil is present with me. When I don't want to do the evil thing, that's what I do. And sometimes, even though we want to keep the law, we can't. And sometimes we actually don't want to. And if we continuously break the law, then we're permanently guilty. And we don't like feeling guilty, do we? So what do? Forget the law. Then you don't feel guilty. Right? I'll pretend that's not what God meant. When he said you mustn't commit adultery, you mustn't let anybody know you're doing it. So gradually, Israel completely forgot the law. If you asked them, they wouldn't be able to tell you what was in it. And so this marriage relationship was broken down, because it takes two to tango. Yeah. They haven't done it. So God is telling Jeremiah, that's it. The covenant is broken. They're not my people anymore. So I won't be their God anymore. I won't protect, I won't provide. You're going to be slaves in Babylon. But then God showed Jeremiah beyond that there would be a new covenant. And that is the one that's operating now. And if anybody, whoever they are, wherever they live, if they want to have a relationship with God, it's got to be on the terms of this covenant, the new one. God is in a position to dictate the terms, and we are not in a position to argue. For example, most of us need air. We don't work very well without it. And the only air available is his. If he decides you're not getting any more, not much you can do about it, is it? So God is in a position to dictate terms. We are not in a position to argue, really. So if you want a relationship with God, then it's got to be on the terms of this new covenant. And we're going to have a look at that and see how realistically we are being a faithful partner to our God. Now, the way this is written is the opposite way around to the way we experience it. So we actually come in on the last line, which says, I will remember their sins no more. What does that mean? I have heard preachers say it means God has a faulty memory. You know, that I could go to God and say, hey, God, you remember that dreadful thing I did last July? And God will say, no. I have a problem with that, frankly, because I remember it. And if I remember it and he doesn't, I know more than he does. Does that sound right to you? Now, somebody gave me a great piece of advice concerning interpreting the Bible. And that is, if the Bible uses a word and you're not sure what it really means, check out the very first time the Bible uses that word, and the context will probably make it clear. So we can do that with this word, remember. See? The first time the Bible uses the word remember is with Noah. You've heard of Noah. He built an unusual sort of boat, didn't he? With an even more unusual crew. Whoa, right. There it is. And Noah and his crew got onto the boat. How long were they on it? Yeah, it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. They were actually on it just over a year. See, that's a long time to be in an ark, isn't it? There was only one window. Only one door, only one window. How many floors were there? 3. That means there's at least one floor that didn't have either a door or a window. What do you think the atmosphere was like in there? And after a year? What happened after a year? Here's what happened. God remembered Noah. It was about time, wasn't it? What does that mean, that God woke up one morning and said, Noah, I better get him out of there before that thing stinks. Those elephants have been busy. No, God hadn't forgotten Noah, had he? No. So if he hadn't forgotten him, how could he remember him? And when God remembers something, he doesn't recall a forgotten item. It just means he takes action concerning that. So when God remembered Noah, he brought him out of the ark. When Abraham was 99, God remembered his promise, and Sarah conceived. So when God remembers your sin, what does that mean? Takes action. Of course he does. God, because of his perfect justice, has to take action concerning every sin. Whoever commits and wherever they do it, God has to take action concerning every sin. Otherwise, he wouldn't be God of justice. But, of course, that's where Jesus comes in. Because God laid all our sins on Jesus. When Jesus in Gethsemane said, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. Let this dreadful experience not happen to me. If it's possible. It wasn't possible. The only way God could accept us was if the absolute righteousness of his law was fulfilled to the letter. And it was fulfilled in Jesus in his life. And then the sin was paid for in his death. As a modern song says, the wrath of God was satisfied. So we come into the new covenant with these words, I will remember your sin no more. I'm not going to do anything else about your sin. I've already done it. But I did it to Jesus. So I won't have to do it to you. The next line up says, I will forgive their wickedness. And some of us, if our dictionary isn't very up to date and alive, some of us think not punishing is the same as forgiveness, and forgiveness means not punishing. It doesn't. Quite a different idea. Forgiveness means whatever the offense has been removed from between us. So that the relationship, although broken by the offense, is now totally restored as though it had never happened. That God looks at you and me as though we were absolutely sinless, never had sin. I know some people go around thinking that God doesn't have a very high opinion of me. I've gone and forgiven the wretch, but look at him. Yuck. No, see, Paul says we're accepted in the beloved. In other words, you are as welcome in the presence of God as Jesus Christ himself. And he sees you clothed in the righteousness of Christ, just as he saw Jesus clothed in your sin when he was on the cross. So this then is the beginning of the new covenant. When we first commit ourselves to Christ, he says, I'm not going to do anything else about your sin. That's all over. And you are forgiven. And in my book, you are as welcome as my son, Jesus. So moving up from there, no longer will a man teach his neighbor or a man his brother, saying, know the Lord, for they'll all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. And this word know is a very beautiful word, applying the same technique as with remember. When does the Bible first use that word? And it's very early on. Here's what it says. Adam knew his wife, and she conceived and bore a son. That's pretty intimate, isn't it? And this is the relationship that God wants with us, not a kind of distant one, but more intimate than any human relationship. He wants us to share our complete thought life and let him enrich and correct our thought life. Some people confine their relationship with God to an hour a week and think that God's fortunate to get that. You know, I can go to church every week. Pretty good, huh? If that's not good enough for God, too bad for God. No, too bad for you. Some people think if they give God an hour a day, that should be okay. But it's a kind of unusual hour if we give him that hour a day, because all the practices and what we might call real life are left out. And that's what God wants to be in. He wants to be in our relationships. He wants to be in our sorrows and our joys and our disappointments and our challenges. They will all know me, from the least to the greatest. Which is interesting because it's the opposite way around to the way we usually do things. You know, if something important is happening, then we invite the great ones. You know, the stars, the celebrities. And if something big is happening like that, they get invited. You and I don't. Eventually they might get down to us if it's a spacious enough auditorium or whatever. But God doesn't do it that way. See, they will all know me from the least to the greatest. We'll start with the least, and even the greatest won't be excluded as long as they don't let their greatness get in the way. So I would like to ask myself, and I'd like you to ask yourself, and not just at this moment, but from time to time during the next few days, would I be content with a relationship with my spouse that was no more intimate than my relationship with my God? Does God maybe feel a bit cheated that he's left out of a whole lot of things? Now it says, they will be my people. One of the really sad things about modern life is loneliness. People who don't belong. Refugees. At the moment, we're getting about 1,000 a day coming into Britain. A lot of British people don't want them. They don't have anywhere to belong. Sometimes people live alone and they don't really meet anybody at any depth for weeks. Occasionally they die alone, nobody knows they're dead until somebody finds a bill that hasn't been paid. It's really nice to belong, isn't it? And to know you belong. I taught for many years in a Bible school that takes place in a castle in England. It has a wonderful staircase. It's about 10 feet wide. And there's a stained glass window over it. And a big lounge hall with a huge fireplace that burns 9-foot long logs. And a big chandelier. And once I was in the hall there when I heard what sounded like the war cry of a Cherokee Indian from up on the stairs. And I looked up, and here was a 19-year-old blonde girl from Texas. And she was leaping downstairs 4 at a time. And there was a nice oak banister running alongside the stairs at an angle of 32 degrees to the horizontal. Just great for sliding down, except the brass knobs every 3 feet that slowed you down a bit. So she wasn't sliding down, she was jumping down. And she hit the bottom step, and there's a post on the end of the rail, and she hooked her elbow around there, and she'd obviously done this a whole lot before, and she was traveling really fast by now, and she flew round, unhooked, sailed through the air for about 6 feet, and landed right next to me. She shouted, "Yippee!" and gave me a big hug and a small kiss. I looked up to see if there were any more, in case they needed the same treatment. But there weren't any more. And when I got home, I thought I should tell my wife about this in case somebody else got in first. And when I did, she said, "Oh, you are slow." And that was exactly what I was thinking. But I was surprised that she was. And then she said, "Don't you know what it's about?" And I said, "Well, obviously, she likes me." "No," she said. "She's getting married, of course." "Oh, is that all?" I thought it was important. Then I asked an obvious question. Who to? Like, who on earth? No. And it's the obvious question you ask, isn't it? We're to be married to Christ. Galatians. You're to be married to another, even to him who is raised from the dead. Who's that? In one sense, it's the Jesus who died for you. In another sense, not him at all. The Jesus who died was poor. Didn't have a home. Didn't have a pillow. Didn't have a coin. Didn't have transport. Didn't have a position. The Jesus who is risen is King of the universe. So, we're to be married to Christ. And this girl leaping downstairs was so excited. Why? At last, she belonged to somebody. Yeah? Somebody actually wanted to spend life with it. They shall be my people. And generally speaking, an object is worth what somebody will pay for it. So what did he pay for you? That's the price he puts on you, the value that he puts on you. But there's another side to it. They shall be my people. See? Supposing you're an esteemed pastor, got to thinking one day, he ought to really have a bigger image in this church. I mean, somebody of such distinguished character and holiness and ability really ought to be revered a little more fully. What he needs is a status symbol. And having thought that through, the obvious status symbol is the right kind of car. And so, having thought about that and thinks about what really be the right one, he decides on a Ferrari. And not just any old Ferrari, but a bright yellow one with purple lightning bolts on it. And a specially souped up variety. And so he checks out with his bank manager to see whether he's got the $45,000 that this particular model will cost. Has he just got that sitting around in the account at the moment doing nothing? And it hasn't, so he saves his astronomical salary for a couple of months and orders one. And when you order a Ferrari, you don't have to go and fetch it. They deliver it to your home. So it's delivered to his home Saturday evening. He leaves it parked in the road outside so the neighbors can see it. And dreams about driving up to church in it. He won't just use it for any old purpose like going joyriding to see if it really will do 220 miles an hour. No, he'll use it to come to church Sunday morning. So he leaves it a little later than usual because, of course, he's going to travel faster. And there's no point in getting here too early or you won't see him arrive. So he needs to be a little bit later. So he does leave it a little bit later. And then he goes out of the house to get in his car and it's not there because his wife has come to church in it. Women have rights in America. And he's very patient, gracious, forgiving, gets on his bicycle, wobbles down here, and he's only a little bit late. And of course forgives his wife, just locks her up in the office to make sure she doesn't do it again. And so, yeah, well, this could work in my favor because they all know it's out there and they're probably wondering whose it is. And when the service is over, I can just go outside and leave in it. And they'll all see me leaving. They'll say, oh, our pastor, wow, what a man. And I won't be there to answer all the nasty questions about how I managed to pay for it. But when he goes out there, it's not there. Jay McCall has been visiting, and he's always had this hankering to drive a Ferrari, and he's gone in it. And Sunday evening, well, the local sheriff is testing it out. He's thinking about getting one for the sheriff's department. And 2 years go by, and he's still not even sat in it. And he sits down one morning and thinks, how much did I pay for that thing? $45,000. Doesn't that mean it's mine? And if it's mine, why are all these other people riding in it? Why don't I get to ride in it? And you're probably thinking this is probably the dumbest story you've ever heard in church. And you're right, of course. Except for one little point. Didn't Jesus pay more than that for you? So who do you belong to? Is it possible, do you think, that Jesus has had some purpose in mind that he wants to use you for, and he hasn't been able to yet, because you've not been available? When you assess your life, plan your week or whatever, you don't think, I don't belong to myself, I belong to him. There's an awful proportion of Christians that I know who plan the whole week to begin with and then see where they can fit God in the time that's left over. And when you think about it, it could be a couple of years that Jesus has been waiting to be able to use you for his purpose. They will be my people. They won't just have the privilege and dignity of knowing they belong to me, they'll actually be available to me 24/7. Then he says, I will be their God. And this is where it gets good, see, because being God means several things. It means authority, for one thing. And I learned about authority in the army. I didn't really want to go in the army. I didn't volunteer, but the Queen apparently knew all about me and invited me to join the army. I think they call it the draft in your country. And I found myself very unwilling in the army, and I just finished a course at the university, degree in science and all the rest of it. Thought I was a very superior young man. And the first creature I really encountered in the army was a gorilla. I had the massive chest, loudest voice I'd ever heard, a brain about the size of a shriveled pea, and 3 stripes on his arm. And he thought he owned me, see, and one of the things he would do, he'd get us all out in the drill square, horrible hairy brown uniform, and brown's never been my colour, and these horrible heavy boots. It made it hard to walk, really, and they were slippery on concrete. And a horrible heavy rifle weighed about 9 pounds. They never gave you any bullets in case you had fun with it, shot the gorilla or something. And we had to keep it highly polished. And he'd get us out there on this enormous concrete square and he'd shout, quick, march! And we'd march the whole length of the square. And just before we fell off the other side, he'd shout, about turn! We'd come all the way back again to where we'd start. And he'd say, about turn! We'd start again. And I'm thinking, you stupid ape. Why don't you think first? Do you want us this side or that side? Make your mind up. And I wasn't getting on well with this at all. When one night, we were all really busy polishing everything that could be polished before parade next morning, when an officer came into our room, captain. And he was looking for somebody called Needham. And I thought, shall I tell him it's me or shall I get under the bed? And as I was debating this with myself, he said, "You're Needham." And I said, "Oh, yes, I'm sorry. I forgot I had a name. I got used to being a number recently." He said, "According to your record, when you were in high school, you were in charge of all the stage equipment for your school theatre." I said, "That's correct, I was." He said, "Good. There's going to be a performance in a couple of weeks. And so tomorrow, you will not go on parade when the rest of the squad go on parade. You will report to the camp theatre and you will check out and examine and perfect every piece of equipment in the theatre. And you will do that every morning until it's all done." And I said, "Yes, sir." And I thought, I could just do with a morning off from the gorilla. This sounds not too bad. So the next morning, when the others all went out marching on down the square, I went to the camp theatre, and I had a couple of bits of wire in my hand to look as though I was working, and I had a mug of nice hot tea in my hand and a kettle on to prepare the next drink, and I'm thinking, this is not a bad deal at all. I can make this last the whole time I'm in the army. When the door flew open and in came the gorilla. And he was upset. He had a way of letting you know when he was upset. And he was upset now. And he said, "What are you doing in here? Get out there on the parade ground now!" And I gave him my nicest smile. And I said, "Good morning, Sergeant. Would you like to check that with Captain Black first? I would be really distressed if you were to get into trouble." He snorted, turned on his heel, stamped out, slammed the door, which is probably still vibrating. And I heard his lovely voice taking out his rage on the rest of the squad out on there. And I sat there contemplating a soldering iron and thinking to myself, isn't it good to be under authority? If I'd just done that on my own initiative, he would have had me running around the assault course till now. But because I did it under the authority of a captain, and me, a sergeant, couldn't touch me. You learn to live that way with God, so that you know that what you're doing is under his authority. Because if you know that, it doesn't matter what anybody else thinks. See, it's how Jesus lived. Sabbath morning, paralyzed man gets healed. Scribes and Pharisees are furious. "Terrible, disgusting, you Sabbath breaker!" And Jesus sat there thinking, "Oh no, I've done it again. I can't get anything right these days." No. My Father's working. So I do. You don't like it? Go and tell him. There's an expression that I've come to really enjoy. Maybe you know it. Not my circus. Not my monkeys. When you let God be the authority over your life, there are no mistakes. And if anybody disagrees with it, too bad for them. You know? And God is the sufficiency in your life. If you look at these lamps up here, they're all shining, and you instinctively know that that's not because they do it by themselves. They're connected to a generator. And when you leave the building, you turn them off. Or maybe before you leave the building, you turn them off. And how ridiculous it would be to go to Walmart and buy yourself a light bulb and bring it home and sit it on the table and said, now shine. Come on, shine. I paid good money for you. Please. I would be so happy if you would just shine. Wouldn't you? I'm getting really annoyed with you. If you don't shine soon, I'm going to put you on the floor and jump on you. Now, if it's an intelligent light bulb, it will be trying desperately hard to shine. You know, flexing its filament and gritting its teeth and trying really hard, but probably won't shine very much. Because it can't. It's not designed to. It's just designed to be connected to a generator, and then without any effort at all, it shines. Jesus said, you're the light of the world. Let your light so shine before men that they will be really impressed and come and slap you on the back and say, you're a hero, you're a star. Well, no. Let your light so shine before men that they will see your good works and praise your generator in heaven. Because they know it's the only way you can behave that way. God, the authority over your life, God, the sufficiency within your life. They will be my people. I will be their God. And then what God has been aiming at all along is the first line. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. The only thing that was wrong with the old covenant was it was external. It was written on tablets of stone. Now it's internal. Written in your mind and in your heart by the Spirit of God. So that it makes perfect sense to you. And you love to do it. It's in your mind, it's in your heart. Which means you live out the law, which means you live out the glory of God. The glory of God is not some mystical light surrounding him. It is what he is in himself, the perfection of his character. The sad thing about the human race is that all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. The new covenant takes us right up there. So this is the new deal that's on offer. It's what Jesus meant when he lifted up that cup of red wine and said, this is my blood of the new covenant shed for you. I am dying to have this kind of relationship with you. I want you to be my bride. So I'll leave that with you. Just chew it over a bit the next few days. See how you're doing. Is God happy with it, or would he like a few adjustments? Thanks.
Thanks, Ken.
Thank you.
I wonder if you'd be willing to answer some questions, if anybody has any questions.
Oh, sure, if they are prepared to stay longer, yeah.
I don't know if you guys have any questions about what he was talking about, but I think that those are some profound truths. I wouldn't go away without questions. So if you don't mind sticking around for a little bit longer, you're welcome to go if you need to. But if you have questions, ask them.
Just wanted to clarify, Ken, the question that you told us to be asking ourselves during this next week. You said, would I be content with a relationship with a spouse? And you were comparing with God. Can you
Yeah.
say that one more time?
Yeah, if my marriage was no more intimate than my relationship with God. That's a question. Huh? Yeah.
Do it from the Hebrew then? You went back to know, and, the word know and all
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Remember, you stick with the Hebrew.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
you can get,
Not that my Hebrew is particularly good, but there are ways of cheating.
I know, that's